Well, after several years of tasting the delights of Princeton, cabarets, cocktail bars, strip clubs, art cinemas, Gyan Prakash was looking for a refuge. For a subaltern scholar and part of the founding committee of the subaltern scholars, and for a man who wrote his first book on bonded labor, he chose not to return to Bihar. He's made a second home. I think he sees it as his primary home, actually, in Bombay. And the passion he has for the city, which I have followed over the years, is quite remarkable. Gyan teaches history at Princeton. He's a historian who specializes in the history of modern India. He has written, as I said earlier, on labor servitude in colonial India. He wrote a book on science called Another Reason, Science and the Imagination of Modern India, and edited after colonialism. He's also edited several books that I won't mention on urbanism. And then just last year, Princeton published his Mumbai Fables. And it's a wonderful follow-on to Suketu's talk, because for those of us who grew up in Bombay in the 60s, Gyan's history, of course, which goes before that and moves beyond that, also beautifully explores many of the urban myths and realities of Bombay. And one of the things about Bombay is that the line between the myths and the realities are actually often very blurred. And he shows this and brings this out extremely beautifully. I don't know what he's going to talk about today, but Mumbai Fables takes many of the incidents of my childhood or my adolescence and presents it with great panache. Gyan was also the director of the Davis Center for 2 terms, and in that context he set up a very interesting set of lectures called Cities, Space, Society and History. I think Arjun spoke at it, I spoke as part of it. So this is in many ways a continuing conversation. Gyan, thank you very much. Welcome.
I should always have Homi introduce me everywhere. It's very good for the soul. Thank you, Mohsen, and thank you, Rahul, very much for inviting me. And over the years, Rahul has been very generous with his archive of knowledge and materials on Bombay. And I think the next book I'll write is Rahul Mehrotra, An Archive of a City. Now, one of the things I discovered as I started working on Bombay was that you cannot be in Bombay and you cannot read anything written on Bombay without encountering a very melancholy narrative of Bombay to Mumbai. I mean, a story of decline. What a great city it was at one time, and how it had declined. For example, if you move from Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, which was published in 1981, to his Moor's Last Sigh, which was published in 1995, you move from a very colorfully raucous and youthful city to a very darkly monochromatic and angry city of ethnic strife and corruption and so on. Or take, for example, Rohinton Mystery's novel Family Matters, which was published in 2002, which is a deeply melancholic novel about aging in Bombay. And in the novel, aging really serves as a kind of allegory for the decline of Bombay from its youthful Bombay to a kind of decrepit Mumbai. And in the novel, and there's here it's actually a connection to Suketu's book. In the novel, there's a character called Mr. Kapoor who deeply believes in the cosmopolitan history of Bombay. And he runs a sporting goods store in Churchgate, and he has a Parsi employee. And he thinks of that Parsi employee as the embodiment of Bombay's cosmopolitan spirit, as Parsis are often seen that way. So this Mr. Kapoor sees the kind of city changing around him, and he's deeply troubled by it, and so he actually tries out the experiment that Suketu just described of traveling in the train. And so there's a passage in the novel where Mr. Kapoor goes to the train, and he's of course dressed in kind of neatly pressed pants, trousers, and he waits for the train to just start moving, and he runs alongside, and he extends his hand, and they push him out. No hands extend out. And for him, then, this was a demonstration of that the cosmopolitan Bombay was no more. And in the novel, then, after this incident, Mr. Kapoor, he speaks about how Bombay was once, he calls it a tropical Camelot, a shining city on the sea. And he despairs of ever kind of recapturing that city. And so he says, it's a wonderful line, he says to his Parsi employee, he says, nothing is left now except to talk of graves, of worms, and epitaphs. Let us sit upon these chairs and tell sad stories of the death of cities. I think the line is ripped off from Richard III, I think. Anyway. And in 2002, Outlook, a popular magazine, published an issue on Bombay, and the issue had the kind of signature image of Marine Drive, which Rahul showed, except it was Marine Drive at night, and the cover was completely black, and on it was emblazoned the title, Bombay, the Death of a Great City. So this kind of a mood is very present, ubiquitous in Bombay. And to some extent you can understand the mood as well. The last few decades have not been very kind to the city. The 1970s and the early 80s saw the dismantling of its cotton mills and the industrial structure that provided a kind of an anchor to the city. And in place of the cotton mills to which kind of city hummed, now you begin to get kind of the cacophony of a mega city. The infrastructure becomes frayed and under great pressure. The social fabric also gets very frayed and becomes very amorphous. And it was in this context that the ranks of the unemployed youth became the recruiting grounds for the Shiv Sena, the nativist and communal political party, and for, of course, the underworld, about which Suketu writes about. And then, of course, in the city's history and city's memory, the 1992 and 93 riots are very prominent, and the city never quite recovered from it. The riot in which the overwhelming majority of victims were Muslims, often targeted by the Shiv Sena gangs. And of course, this was followed by the bomb blasts in March 1993, apparently planned and executed by a Muslim underworld don who sought revenge for his warehouse being burnt during the riot. After the bomb blast, many people wondered if Bombay's cosmopolitan image was as false or as charred as the buildings that were destroyed during the 1993 riot. And then came the floods that the image Rahul showed you, when 37 inches of rain within 24 hours submerged large parts of the city. And to see the kind of image of the city at that time, or to be in the city at that, it's the idea of a city submerging underwater is kind of really deeply mythic stuff. And it seemed to be, the city was literally going underwater. And then a year later, in 2006, there was a series of bombs that exploded in commuter trains with a kind of a clockwork regularity. And then, of course, the terrorist attacks in 2008. It just so happened that from 2005, floods, train attacks, and then terrorist attacks. Each time I was in the city, though I had nothing to do with the things that happened. But in a way, I was able to experience the kind of a trauma that the city went through. So in a way, one can see where the narrative of decline from Bombay to Mumbai sort of comes from. It obviously draws from these kind of traumatic experiences of the city. But the narratives of change from Bombay to Mumbai conceive historical transformation as a movement from one historical stage to another, from the bounded city of industrial capitalism to the generic city of globalization, from modernity to post-modernity, from colonial to post-colonial, from cosmopolitan to communal, and so on. And this narrative is widely shared because it presents itself as historical fact. So you have the nostalgic tropical Camelot and the dystopic city of slums and urban violence appear as compelling bookends of Mumbai's story because they seem to have the force of historical truth. Well, I'm a historian, so I dig and excavate, and I was interested in where these stories come from and what are the stories that they tell and what are the stories that they conceal or suppress. And so what is the past that this story of Bombay to Mumbai discards as history, the city that it discards as history, as over and done with, as gone, as debris. And to access this history of this rubble, of this unofficial history, one that is absent in museums and archives, I found that I had to bring together and confront historical narrative with an account of everyday life. Let me explain. I mean, usually what happens is in social sciences and in history, there is a concern, and these disciplines excel at explaining or dealing with large social forces, institutions, role of political movements, and so on. Whereas novels, short stories, cinema, and journalistic accounts focus on the situational and on the experience of the everyday. So I decided that I wanted to bring these two together. In Homi's terms, you could say I wanted to hybridize these two methods, but I don't mean hybridize in the usual mistaken sense of mixture or pluralism, but the way in which actually Homi uses it as a kind of a productive articulation of incommensurable knowledges and methods, as a form of juxtaposition that produces something, a new insight. And so if I don't succeed, it's Homi's fault because I was following him. So it is with this view that I approached CHOR BAZAAR. A CHOR BAZAAR translates as thieves' market. It is actually a flea market. And this is the image of one of the images of CHOR BAZAAR that I want to show. And what I found in Chor Bazaar is what Rahul calls a kinetic city, a city of layers in which multiple and successive historical slices of the city coexist and jostle against each other in the same time and space. And here I was also thinking a very kind of felicitous phrase that Henri Lefebvre uses when he says that the urban space has a structure more like that of a flaky pastry rather than that of a homogeneous and isotropic space of classical mathematics. And so it's that kind of a layered city that I found in Chor Bazaar. And you can get a vivid sense of this layered history in Chor Bazaar as you traverse the narrow lanes packed tight with vendors and stores selling a bewildering array of goods, genuine antiques and knockoffs, mostly knockoffs, old coins, furniture, hardware, automotive parts, records, Hollywood and Bollywood film posters, and lobby cards, shoes, clothes, and just plain junk. It becomes clear that an extraordinary history is on display here. You can see some of these images where these things are brought together. The debris of commodities and modern life here tells stories about the city. And to make sense of these narratives, I had to begin with the name. Let me tell you how Chor Bazaar got its name, said Zafar Bhai, the owner of Jubilee Decorators, a shop selling antique furniture and decorative objects in Chor Bazaar. You see, the name goes back to, he said, the name goes back to the time when the Gateway of India was built, when Queen Victoria visited Bombay. He continued with a tale of a theft. When a ship docked, she discovered that her violin was missing. She sent out her soldiers to Bombay, and they found her missing violin in Chor Bazaar. It wasn't called Chor Bazaar then. It was called Mutton Market. And so she told the Bombay government to rechristen the place as Chor Bazaar because that's where her stolen violin was found. This is how the place got its name, he said. Of course, Queen Victoria never set foot in Bombay. The gateway was built to commemorate the visit of Prince of Wales in 1911 and was completed only in 1924. To be sure, the story is apocryphal, and yet it contains a representation of the past, one that is very different from that which appears in the archives. Like the bazaar which exists on the margins of the mainstream markets, this historical representation lurks outside the shadows of disciplinary history. There are no documentary records or commemorative plaques to substantiate this expression of the past. It survives precariously in recycled stories as a faint impression, imperfect and obscure. And enter this world of the past, of this past, and unexpected knowledge greets you. To begin with, let us take the colonial genealogy of the name suggested by the story. Now, flea markets are not unusual. All across the world, one finds places for trade in the debris of modernity. But to my knowledge, nowhere are these places called Chor Bazaar, or thieves' market. It is telling that this term was also used in colonial cities to name sites for trade in used goods. Delhi also had one with this name, now demolished. Such bazaars probably followed the establishment of orderly markets where colonial subjects were expected to act as modern bourgeois consumers. But when commodities sold in the organized and official precincts are used up, they lose the legitimacy conferred by the shine of newness. Faded and worn out, when these artifacts return from the dead to assume a second life as recycled goods, they probably appear as illegitimate. To the British, Chor Bazaar must have seemed an appropriate name for a place where Indians, who in any case frequently appeared as untrustworthy and dishonest in colonial stereotypes, bought goods to live stolen lives. It is no wonder then that Zafar Bhai's story pins responsibility on the British for the naming of the market. CHOR BAZAAR probably followed the establishment of Crawford Market, which was built in the 1860s, and the founding of the arcades on DN Road, or Hornby Road as it's called now, during the late 19th century, when the city expanded beyond the fort precincts. The Gazetteer, published in 1909, doesn't mention the CHOR BAZAAR, suggesting that the bazaar emerged only in the early decades of the 20th century. By this time, the cotton mills had expanded, and the city was flush with poor migrants who were employed as mill workers. Its location in an area thoroughly revamped by the City Improvement Trust during the 1910s also suggests that the market made its appearance when Bombay became a thriving industrial city. Zafar Bhai's reference to Queen Victoria, or the Prince of Wales for that matter, and the construction of Gateway of India also suggest the same. The apocryphal story then captures something of Mumbai's colonial history as a modern industrial city, but it refers to a heritage that is very different from that monumentalized in the parade of Gothic revival buildings that Rahul showed. Rather than commemorating the self-representation of British power, and it's really interesting the way in which that whole Gothic district is lined. It's lined as a kind of as a parade, as a kind of processional sort of space. So rather than commemorating that, the self-representations of British power, CHOR BAZAAR, it registers the colonial framing of the life cycle of commodities as they changed from their state of glittering newness in the shopping arcades and established markets to their condition as old, used debris in CHOR BAZAAR. Modernity and debris go hand in hand. As commodity production quickens the pace of life, it also hastens the speed of obsolescence. Not only does it label existing artifacts as traditional and outmoded, it quickly renders its own products out of date. You can find these outmoded commodities in CHOR BAZAAR. Old mariner's compass, cuckoo clocks, Art Deco furniture, decorative objects, film memorabilia, and a baffling assortment of other goods. Each object tells you a story of Mumbai's urban life. Take, for example, old jazz records. Besides telling us about the change in the recording technology and medium, the presence of these records in CHOR BAZAAR suggests a decline in the appreciation of jazz in Bombay. In the 1960s and 70s in particular, there were a whole troupe of American jazz musicians, Dave Brubeck and so on, who visited Bombay. Restaurants where jazz was a regular fare until the early 70s either no longer exist or have moved on to other musical offerings. With the change in the social world that patronized jazz, the records too have moved on, ending up on the dusty shelves in CHOR BAZAAR. Look closely at the fusion music of Hindi films and Latin beats, and you will find the lost world of Goan musicians who were in the forefront of Western music in the city until the early 70s. Synthesizers and changes in musical taste in Hindi cinema have rendered this earlier form of musical cosmopolitanism obsolete. But the bazaar is still a rich archive of such discarded this is the Crawford Market and Hornby Road I was talking about. Bazaar is a rich archive of such discarded history. The people who know Bombay will know this is Naresh Fernandez, who's a great aficionado of jazz. And actually, I went with Naresh to CHOR BAZAAR for something else. And then Naresh, the moment he discovered this, his favorite kind of shop that keeps these jazz records, he just started looking through them, and so I just took a picture of him and then put it in my. Was he the editor of Time Out? He was the editor of Time Out, Time Out Mumbai. Yeah. At first glance, the odd collection of old artifacts in the bazaar appears as just that, odd. But if you examine it carefully, you find that the arbitrariness repositions these commodities. It tears them away from their original historical context and places them in a new environment. The unexpected juxtaposition of records and postcards, clocks and curios, posters and furniture in the bazaar functions like a montage, breaking up the smooth and evolutionary surface of historical representation. So the representation of Bombay to Mumbai is broken up by this kind of a montage-like appearance of commodities. You see the city's urban heritage not in a linear fashion, but in the heretical arrangement of fragmentary and spatial combinations. History appears jagged and disjointed as your eyes move from the old hardware parts to beautiful objects sculpted in glass, from jazz records of the 60s to knockoffs of Art Deco furniture fabricated today. The aura of heritage is broken by the arbitrary collection of commodities. Existing in the shadow of mainstream markets and carrying an air of illegitimacy, both in its name, Chor Bazaar, and the goods it transacts, the bazaar represents cities' history in junk, memorabilia, antiques, copies, and kitsch. There are no stories of rise and fall, of glory and decline, but only debris of Mumbai's modern life here. You do not find history memorialized and frozen in a museum here. The remaindered past is alive, active in the present and everyday experience. Breathing life into what has been discarded as junk by history, it exerts pressure on the historical narrative of Bombay to Mumbai. Thank you.
Listening this afternoon to a whole range of reflections on Bombay, urban, architectural, everyday life, communal, memorabilia, the debris of the modern life of this great city, brings to mind somebody who I want to spend a few minutes talking about. Please forgive me if I do this, but I feel it welling up in me, and I want to say this here and now. Carol Breckenridge, Arjun Appadurai's lifetime partner, who is no longer with us, was to my knowledge, one of the earliest people, scholars, visitors, who fell deeply in love with the architectural fabric of the city. In fact, she wrote about it. She had a long-term project on Bombay Moderne. She observed the Art Deco construction of the city, the Art Deco in the buildings, the Art Deco in the furniture. And in the journal that they both started, Public Culture, she made records of it. She commissioned people to write about it. And I want just to maintain a few seconds silence in her memory, because she put this city, its excitement, its aesthetics, on the map for us. And what we do today, in many ways, follows her interest and the archive that she built up. Many of those who've written about Bombay since were scouted out by her. She had a nose for that kind of emerging insight. She was like a truffle hound. She knew exactly where all the delicious truffles were hidden. So if we could just keep a few seconds silence in her memory, I'd be very grateful. Thank you very much. Well, the last of our guys. Liza? Liza Weinstein is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Northeastern. Liza, I'm sorry, I don't know you, so I can't tease you like I have done it to my other friends and colleagues here. But soon. I thought you'd miss it. Christ. Her research and areas of interest include urban sociology, globalization, political economy, political sociology, and development in South Asia. Liza has written several very interesting articles, and I think really brings a very important material, political, and municipal focus to our discussions today. I, just for your attention, mention some of them. Global recognition, local legitimacy, the role of planning consultants in the making of Bombay's global downtown. I think we might have heard a little bit about this, but we look forward to hearing more. Liza Weinstein and Tarini Bedi have also got an article called Building Politics, Gender and Political Power in Globalizing Mumbai, in a book edited by S. Dasgupta called Gender and Power in Global Context, New Delhi Sage. It's in press. The next one has a number of Chinese names that I can't pronounce, so I'll just skip it over and go to the one after that, the single-authored Liza Weinstein, Mumbai's Development Mafias. Where are we? Put your hands up. The Bombay Mafia. Identify yourselves here and now. Bombay's Development Mafia. I hope you notice that I've dressed myself for the part. Organized Crime, Land Development and Globalization, published in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, Volume 32. Liza has a set of external affiliations, too, which make her remarkably well suited for this talk. We are looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Somehow. And ultimately, this distinction is quite dangerous, suggesting that representative politics of the poor are invariably corrupt or nefarious. But one important consequence of elections is the disruptive power that they hold. The ways that resources are mobilized in the lead up to elections and all else falls by the wayside. So while this happens everywhere and is typically lamented as an inefficiency of the democratic process, it has a much needed slowing effect in Mumbai. Projects are halted out of fear of politicizing development, and at least for the time being, people stay put. So this has certainly been the case with the Dharavi project. This high-profile plan that's been in the works for over a decade is heralded by routine announcements that ground will be broken soon and the redevelopment project is going to begin. But each time an election approaches at the national, state, or municipal level, the project is halted, put on temporary hold, to be resumed again after the election season. And meanwhile, after each cloud of election dust has settled, the newly elected officials tend to take their time getting up to speed, and the start date is invariably pushed back again. But while these delays may have a protective effect, the uncertainty is harmful to Dharavi's residents. Residents fail to make much-needed repairs to their homes because they don't know whether their homes will remain. Upgrades to improve the residents' quality of life are not made because nobody really knows what the future will hold. So additionally, these populist promises that are made during election time often get translated into very protective measures on paper alone. And given the dramatic disjuncture between policy and implementation that shapes so much of municipal governance, one need only look to these policies rarely have their promised effects. So one need only look to the litany of laws like rent control, the Urban Land Ceiling Act, and the various environmental protections to see how little what little effect these policies have had on the equitable distribution of land and housing. But instead, these policies have largely created very healthy markets of exemptions and of backdoor modes of development. So meanwhile, it's these markets and these backdoor forms of development that have been managed in large part through the process of gundagiri. So gundagiri, very loosely translated, is the power of the thug or the strong arm. And it's widely recognized as how things actually get done. So casting aside the moral concerns from the more civil factions of civil society, it's simply impossible to study governance or politics without bringing in gundagiri. So unfortunately, gundas are an unreliable sort, though, and the informal practices and the illicit arrangements that give power to the poor are just as likely to take it away. So, but even so, gundagiri is a democratic manifestation that probably more than any other has protected the rights of the urban masses in Mumbai to stay put. So Dharavi, like most of the city's other informal settlements, was built by gundagiri in a process referred to by some as pirate urbanization. Slumlords and local entrepreneurs began subdividing public or unbuilt private lands and renting or selling plots to new migrants. And these entrepreneurs, meanwhile, provided residents with water and electrical connections and paid the police and municipal workers to protect the land holdings of the illegal residents and the informal shop owners. So in this way, they filled essential services and protective roles in areas largely untouched by formal state institutions. Yet in recent years, as we've heard about in several of the preceding presentations, property markets have exploded in Mumbai, and both the state and private capital have taken more deliberate steps to initiate development projects and to clear centrally located lands. But because these local gundas have been acting as landlords, service providers, and a de facto state in many of these communities for decades, the development projects being launched have had to include these groups as stakeholders, often bringing them directly into decision-making processes. So meanwhile, with land speculation driving up prices in places like Dharavi in advance of impending redevelopment schemes, many residents now complain about the use of gundagiri against them, not protecting their right to stay put, but to helping dispossess them in the name of accumulation. So on one hand, gundagiri and the brokering politics that it represents is very much what James Scott means when he talks about weapons of the weak. But it's a weapon that can be used against the poor as much as it can be used by the poor. So again, with the democratic possibilities of the city lie the potential for extraction. But it's through these messy, often democratic contestations and negotiations that the city is continually made and remade. So I'm not going to devote much attention to discussing the power of the public interest litigation, but it bears some important mentioning. So a number of researchers and political theorists have written about in recent years that the courts have emerged as a formidable institution of policymaking in urban India. From more draconian rulings like the 1985 Supreme Court ruling that gave the municipal corporation the right to demolish the homes of pavement dwellers, to the more protective measures that ensure the housing rights of Dharavi's more recent arrivals, court rulings invariably shape both positive and negatively the occupancy rights of Mumbai residents. So while some have celebrated the court's intervention in this domain, others have lamented the overreach of the judiciary. But regardless, the act of filing a PIL, regardless of the particular public or constituency being represented in the case, is a very consequential expression of democracy with dramatic consequences on the city's physical form. So lastly, I'm highlighting the seizing of democratic windows. And what I mean here are those brief and often fleeting moments that arise when public opinion matters most and social movements have their most dramatic consequences. So one of these windows, as we've all been paying very close attention, has opened recently this winter in Tunisia and across North Africa. But another has opened in the context of the Dharavi redevelopment project over the last few years, when fears about capital flight and the disruptive potential of mobilized groups created the opening for some, albeit highly constrained, resident and activist input into the planning process. So while a few such windows have opened throughout the project's longue durée, one opened in June and July of 2007. So on June 1st, a global tender was floated in newspapers around the world, inviting investors to prepare bids for the scheme. Within days, 78 expression of interest documents were submitted, including 25 by international development firms. And within days as well, protests were launched, including several very publicized demonstrations in Dharavi. Activists wrote letters to the state's chief minister, as well as to the Prime Minister of India, and reached out internationally to prominent activists and scholars. Most of the people on the panel signed on to letters directed toward the Prime Minister, that these letters and these claims implored the state to pursue a more inclusive development process and to ensure that the benefits of development remained in Dharavi. But other activist demands were more specific, such as that changes are made to the rules governing eligibility for the project, and that the size of homes increase. The size of homes proposed for construction under the scheme were increased. And in some cases, with respect to some of these demands, the government conceded somewhat quickly, and increasing the square footage of homes as proposed, and setting up an advisory committee to oversee the planning process for the scheme. And so these outcomes, which were certainly efforts to pacify or co-opt the project opponents, were at least in part the product of the project's administrators' desire to facilitate a smooth and relatively uncontested development process. So these dynamics have produced a democratic space that will almost certainly close once the developers are selected and the project construction begins. And the activists and the community leaders negotiating around these demands recognize the tenuous and fleeting nature of these democratic spaces, and of this one in particular, and have been working to codify tacit agreements into legally binding policy to ensure the greatest possible benefits for themselves and their constituencies. So overall, the democratic manifestations certainly do not exhaust the possibility of the democratic possibilities in Mumbai, and reflect just some of the ways that the physical form and the structures of social life are in constant dialogue and negotiation with one another in Mumbai. So clearly, the democratic city does not produce an inclusive city, as dramatic disparities and injustices certainly remain. But to recognize the ways that democratic expressions shape the life of the city is to provide a much needed corrective, I think, to the totalizing narrative of dispossession. So amidst this city of change, some things do remain durable.